China and India, the two most populous countries on Earth. And like a scene from the most popular Indian movie in China, Dangal, China and India could soon be in the ring, wrestling it out. And by ring, I mean the Doklam Plateau. And by wrestling, I mean shooting, with guns, or nuclear weapons. But don't worry, they're not actually going to use nuclear weapons. Probably. Since June, China and India have been in their most serious military standoff in decades. Americans know India as the land of the Taj Mahal, the birthplace of Buddhism, and the backdrop of the world's most influential nonviolent resistance movement. I'm just kidding, of course. Most Americans know India as the land of the Taj Mahal, the birthplace of Quickie Mart owners, and the backdrop of that one Wes Anderson movie. This is India. It has this sort of flap in the northeast that's connected by the narrow Siliguri corridor. It's less than 17 miles wide at one point. It's sometimes called the Chicken's Neck. I'm going to come back to that. The military standoff is happening near the three-way border of China, India, and the tiny kingdom of Bhutan. Americans know Bhutan for its archery, Buddhism, and being the happiest country on Earth. Look at how happy they made the British. I'm just kidding, of course. Most Americans know, okay, they've never heard of Bhutan. Anyway, it's here, between northeast India and Chinese Tibet. Bhutan has less than 1 million citizens. Its army is so small it relies on India for military support. Now, China and India have had their share of border disputes over the years. Most notably, in 1962, they actually fought a war over a disputed border. But that was a different time and in a different place. This border dispute is actually happening in Bhutan. Or in China, depending on which country you ask, but not in India. You see, China's People's Liberation Army has been building a road through part of Bhutan, or as the Chinese Communist Party calls it, part of Chinese territory since ancient times. It's hard to find accurate maps of this region online. Apparently those guys at Google Maps have more important things to do than try to correctly draw disputed borderlines in far-off lands. Important things like turning Google Maps into a Pac-Man game. Anyway, the dispute seems to be happening somewhere in this region, part of the Doklam Plateau. The thing is, while this is the map according to India and Bhutan and Google, this is the map according to China and its Google knockoff, Baidu. Anyway, Bhutan was obviously more than a little miffed at the presence of Chinese troops in its territory. But from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, they simply sent the army in to build a road inside China. That's why China had a major problem when Indian soldiers tried to stop what the Chinese Defense Ministry called the normal activity of the Chinese border defense troops. To be fair, for the Chinese regime, construction in disputed territory is normal activity. But from India's perspective, Bhutan asked India for help, so India sent in troops to Bhutan. An initial scuffle happened on June 16th. Now, both sides have stationed thousands of troops along the border in what's become a month-long standoff. And neither side wants to back down.
I want to remind India, don't leave things to luck and unrealistic illusions. Shaking a mountain is easy, but shaking the PLA is hard.
Yes, you don't shake the PLA. In disputed territory, the PLA shakes you. At least according to this India Today video.
Its personnel were caught on camera jostling with Indian troops sometime in second week of June across the ILAC in Sikkim.
So why is this a big deal for India when the PLA is mainly just building roads in China/Bhutan? Well, for over a decade, the Chinese Communist Party has been building roads deeper into Tibet, and not just to bring happiness and prosperity to the locals. The roads greatly speed up the Chinese regime's ability to move troops through the region. This narrow finger of Tibet borders India's Sikkim region to the west and Bhutan to the east. It's also of strategic importance. According to Indian military experts speaking to the BBC, Sikkim is the only area through which India could make an offensive response to a Chinese incursion, and the only stretch of the Himalayan frontier where Indian troops have a terrain and tactical advantage. Essentially, in the event of war, that would be the last good place for India to defend against a Chinese incursion. And if the Chinese troops were to incur, well, remember the Siliguri corridor, the Chicken's Neck? It's only half a day's drive by highway. So India may be imagining a possible war scenario where Chinese troops enter India through this disputed border region and then occupy the Siliguri corridor, cutting the chicken's neck. That would separate the main part of India from its 8 northeastern states. By the way, if you're wondering why the map of India looks so crazy, you can thank Prince William's great-grandfather. Of course, when the map was drawn back in 1947, Tibet was an independent country ruled by this guy. But that's another story. Anyway, this whole border dispute between India and China is basically over maintaining the ability to fight a future war with the other. Fortunately, this conflict hasn't gotten out of control, besides that Dongal movie-inspired wrestling, which is merely off the hook. No shots have been fired as far as we know, but China has been continually holding live-fire drills in Tibet, or as the Chinese military calls them, war games. The military says they were merely to test the brigade's joint strike capability on plateaus. You know, plateaus in general, definitely not any particular plateau. Meanwhile, as I mentioned last week, the Indian government is preparing weapons for a short, intense war. You know, a short, intense war in general. And while it's always nice to say no one wants war, this time it's more complicated. Neither Chinese leader Xi Jinping nor Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi wants an actual full-scale war, but neither of them wants to back down either. India needs to show Bhutan it's capable of supporting them. After all, Bhutan is India's only neighbor that can be called a true ally against China. But most importantly, neither Xi nor Modi can afford to look politically weak. Modi will be up for Indian re-election in 2019, or maybe earlier. So politically, it can't look like he's caving into China. Xi Jinping doesn't exactly face an election, but the Chinese Communist Party's 19th Party Congress is coming up in November. And the changes he'll announce there are going to create political enemies. So Xi can't afford to look like he's caving to India. And in particular, my favorite state-run media, the Global Times, is really pushing hard for war, telling India not to forget who won the last war, that things are going to escalate, and that China will kill everybody. So both sides are grandstanding, and no one wants to back down. But you know who's really to blame, according to the Global Times? That's right, America. Also, any other country like Australia that calls for de-escalating the situation. For now, though, nothing terrible has happened. But if shots are fired and soldiers are killed, then there'll be a lot of political pressure to respond with Global Times-style violence. Really, they should just resolve it by wrestling in the ring, like men. Or, you know, women.